show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, what's up?
Oz, what's up is the Brisbane Broncos did win the Rugby League Grand Final, as I pretty boldly predicted before the game had been played in our Monday episode.
It was a cracking
game. It was great viewing as well because the Channel 9 commentary team was in flying form. My favourite moment was maybe Brad Fittler in the closing minutes saying, "I don't think anyone here knows what we're watching. The teams are going from one end to the other." And I just thought, Bradley, I think we're watching rugby league. That sounds like rugby league to me. What do you think of the game?
Very standard rugby league. Look, I thought it was a great game. I mean, I knew that it was going to be pretty good. There's two very good teams, even though I massively dislike both of them. The Melbourne Storm are like just an evil team. And, you know, to bring this back to the media chat, the Brisbane Broncos are owned by a news corporation. So a very hard team to get very enthused by. I'm sort of just focusing on the fact that, you know, we have the grand final winning duo of Adam Reynolds and Coach Michael Maguire reunited. You know, they won the grand final together for the Bunnies back in 2014 when we shut down Redfern Street. So I'm sort of just like very loosely claiming this as a as an 11 years later Rabbitohs redo. That's my only way of understanding anything good out of this result.
Yeah, I sort of wanted to mention it because I think there's an interesting media story even for those who aren't really interested in rugby league, and that's that in the aftermath of this, Brisbane's star player, this guy Reece Walsh, and Reece Walsh is maybe the best looking rugby league player ever. The boss of the NRL once dubbed him rugby league's Justin Bieber, this guy. Yeah. And if you aren't into rugby league and just like casually looking at the news, after the grand final, you would have seen headlines that would have, I think, made you think that he's some like evil, awful guy, like another rugby league player embroiled in something awful. There were headlines like Reece goes rogue, Broncos face fine for grand final celebration, which was on news.com.au. What actually happened here, Oz, is Reece Walsh played a pretty funny joke at the media's expense, I would say. Like a month or so ago, knowing the media are suckers for a story like this, Reece posted a Snapchat of him taking a big, refreshing sip of water out of a toilet. And this blew up. But what the media didn't realize was this toilet was like freshly installed at the house. No one had like ever used it before. It had literally just gone in. It was just bait. But it blew up into this massive story. Media went mental about it before Reece revealed the truth. And then after the grand final and he won, Reece had a mug shaped like a little toilet and drank some celebratory beers out of it, passed it around to the coach, Michael Maguire, and everyone had fun with it, and it was sort of a joke at the media's expense for buying into this. But the like pathetic thing about modern sports media, Oz, is like, even though they were the butt of the joke, they keep headlining this playful prank like Reece Walsh, an Indigenous Maori guy, is some kind of out of control, evil rugby league player going rogue during celebrations. It's super weird.
Yeah, it's really weird. And there's two bits to this, I reckon, that are really frustrating. One is just how the sports media works now. It's like we're days after the grand final, and even like, you know, we're now like 2 weeks on from the AFL grand final and the Geelong Mad Monday stuff, but we're getting a reaction to the reaction to the reaction. And like you said, in this case of Reece Walsh, he's taken the piss out of the media, but they're still finding these crazy clickbaity ways to just kind of drive anger or like hate clicks or generate controversy for the sake of it. And like Reece Walsh is a very good player. He's a very good looking guy, which I think is always funny to mention just because in the context of rugby league, you don't get many of them. And I feel like the fact that the media seem to hate him so much is like a big part of why I've got a soft spot for him, right? Despite the fact that he plays for Brisbane and I have a lot of issues with that. It's just sort of like, I'm in his camp when it comes to the way he's treated with dumb stories like this.
Totally.
Scott, there is another quick thing I wanted to touch on before we get into the episode proper. Last week on the show, you and I had different views on how significant the Nicole Kidman-Keith Urban separation was, or maybe at least like a different vibe on how much it impacted us
One
personally.
of our
You were
most
quite impacted by
controversial
it.
debates. It was a huge schism through the heart of Lamestream.
Yeah, people say we agree too much on the show. This was a fundamental disagreement we had. You were quite impacted by the separation. I sort of didn't care, but I'm bringing it back up because some mail has come my way, and this is not. Yeah, this is not the kind of thing we normally cover, but I have some sources close to Keith's camp, and I feel like I may as well share this news. Yeah, people are going to think this sounds like a joke. This is not a joke. This is like, I've got sources in all sorts of places, right? I've been in this business for a long time. I've done all sorts of wacky things in my life. I have some intelligence about what's going on. And I thought about, like, do I talk about this on this show? And I'm like, I have nowhere else to talk about it. We'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about it. People can take it or leave it, and we can move on and talk about more serious issues. But look, and some of this may already be out there on TMZ. I don't follow this story closely enough to know if this is like juicy news or if it's already out there. So apologies if you care heaps and you already know what I'm about to say. But there are two things that I am reliably informed of, right? The first thing is that this separation has been brewing for months. Keith has been down in the dumps for most of his current world tour. It wasn't a sudden thing sparked by a particular incident. This has been something that has been plaguing him for pretty much his whole world tour, like months and months of him feeling pretty depressed and down in the dumps as a result of the relationship, his marriage breaking down. The second thing is that there's been these rumors that he's in a relationship with a guitarist in his band. And I'm told that that is not true. And this rumor started when the singer posted clips of Keith Urban changing lyrics in a song that was written about Nicole Kidman to be about her. Videos of these clips that the singer posted were shared before the separation, but they've been dug up by kind of the celebrity rags as proof that these two are having an affair or in some sort of like relationship. This particular guitarist, she's like the second or third backup guitarist in Keith's band. She doesn't regularly perform with Keith. It was kind of an unusual time that she did. Keith often changes that lyric, and it's actually been causing some frustration in the Keith camp that people are kind of hanging on to this one thing as evidence that he's been having an affair with her, and that's what's precipitated this marriage breakdown. She seems to be loving the attention and the limelight, and I'm told that's something else that's causing a little bit of tension within Keith's camp. And look, my source on this, I trust them. They are close to Keith and Keith's camp, but celeb goss Scott, it's not my forte. So if Demois comes out tomorrow with like undeniable proof that they are in some sort of affair and they contradict everything I'm saying, I'm sorry to everyone, but I also don't care. I just decided I needed to share this piece of intelligence, and my source was quite happy for me to share it. So there we are.
I can't believe you still don't care after revealing that. Like, how did you not get invested? That's all so exciting. Look, I mean, I'm still like basically invested in this because I love Nicole and I hope she's doing very well. But I'm glad to hear that, you know, it seems like whatever breakdown there wasn't maybe caused by an affair with this guitarist. I guess that's good to know.
Yeah, my source couldn't confirm that there was no other affair, but they said they don't know if there is, and it's definitely not with this guitarist. But look, if I hear anything else, I'll let you know. Maybe I won't. Maybe we'll get like 1,000 emails from people saying, what the hell are you guys doing? But it's nice to just, you know, start with some lighter stuff before we get into it. But Scott, let's get into it. Today on the show, we're going to put the spotlight on Australia's political journalists, in particular, the National Press Club in Canberra. This might not be an organisation a lot of people are familiar with, unless you've taken their day off and happened to stumble onto a stream of their addresses being broadcast on the ABC in the middle of the day, but it's a pretty influential body, and it's now facing accusations of censorship on the issue of, you guessed it, Gaza. On Tuesday, we sent out an exclusive story to subscribers of our newsletter about a talk that was cancelled. It was a talk supposed to be held by a Pulitzer Prize winner at the National Press Club. It was cancelled because the National Press Club says he was too in favour of Palestine. We're going to break down that story and take a closer look at the National Press Club, who runs it, who funds it, and what our colleagues in Canberra are really getting up to. And I guess it's a good reminder that if you want more exclusive stories like that hold our media to account, and you want to support the work that we do, you can sign up to subscribe at lamestream.com.au. Plus, in keeping tabs, we'll take a look at the treatment of those who participated in the most recent Gaza flotilla, including Greta Thunberg, And Scott, we've been warning our listeners about this for months, but it's finally happened. Over in the US, the right-wing pro-Israel journalist Bari Weiss and her anti-woke media startup, the Free Press, have been bought by CBS. She's going to be the editor-in-chief of CBS News, one of the most prestigious news networks in the United States, despite having zero experience in TV and being little more than a suck-up to tech billionaires and Zionists. It's a pretty big media story. We're going to get into what it means for the US media landscape and for those of us here in Australia. But first, Scott, this week marked 2 years of Israeli genocide in Gaza, 2 years of cowardice by our government, and 2 years of some of the worst attempts to cover a story that I think we've seen, you and I have seen, in our time in the Australian media landscape. It's not true, Scott, to say that like this podcast and the work that we do is a direct result of like the betrayal of very fundamental journalistic principles that we've seen over the past 2 years, but it's like not totally untrue either. Our concerns around how the mainstream media operates predates their attempt to cover the war in Gaza, but I think witnessing firsthand just how shamelessly once reputable news organizations became little more than just propaganda outlets for the Israeli government or for the pro-Israel lobby in Australia, how editors were more than happy to bully Arab and Muslim journalists out of the profession if they didn't sign up to that propaganda effort. That definitely influenced our desire, our decision to make something new. Is there anything from the last couple of years that stands out to you in terms of like how debased this industry of ours has become?
I mean, I think the big thing that stands out to me, Oz, is you look back at the people who, you mentioned, were fired, had managers ban them from working on any stories on Gaza, or just like disheartened by the entire thing and kind of managed out of journalism. And if you look at what those people were calling for, look at like the letter that journalists signed back in November of 2023, so early, which led to a lot of them being blacklisted. That letter calls for Australian news organizations to condemn the killing of journalists, to treat Israeli sources with skepticism, to prioritize like reports from the ground, from first-hand witnesses and from respected international observers. And now, 2 years later, like the ABC has issued a statement condemning the killing of journalists. You have editors who enforced the bans on these people who are now writing editorials about how Israel, may not be able to be trusted. So the people who called for all of that stuff were correct. And I should admit, I signed that letter, Oz, but like, if what they called for was correct, why is it them that paid the price? They couldn't be trusted to tell this story to Australians. Australians didn't get the reporting of the truth that they deserved. But the people who defended the kind of lies, enforced the bans, there's no reckoning for them. And I just think, if you look back over the totality of the 2 years, I think that explains a lot about what we've seen and where we are still at across Australian media today, 2 years on.
Yeah, really good reminder of that letter and like how so many organizations are kind of maybe starting to inch their way towards sort of those principles, but no reckoning with how they treated people who signed that letter or people who asked for better from those newsrooms. I feel like 2 years on from that is a good time to look at whether there's been any reflection or any real shifts in terms of how the media has been covering. I mean, I think it's the most consequential story of our lifetimes. And
totally.
We've talked a bit about the ABC in particular. I think our general view is that there has been some shifts there in terms of the way that they've responded, perhaps to internal and external pressure, their use of the language, the way that they used to defer to the Israeli government and how that has shifted slightly in the way that they are now being a bit more explicit in just saying the Israeli government says this, but here's other evidence that contradicts it. That just wasn't there at the beginning of this war. But I think beyond that, Scott, it's hard to see a lot of change. On Monday, we talked about how the editor of The Age, a paper that I think almost more than any other has really shredded what used to be its progressive reputation in order to just propagandize the Zionist position. We talked about how the editor had a bit of a brain snap and launched this weird campaign denigrating the independent media. That's kind of like how they're going, right? They seem to be extremely defensive and kind of just doubling down on their approach on kind of Israel and Gaza in particular. 2 years on from October 7 is a time to look at where they're all at, right? Covering the genocide and, The coverage this week across the board, I think there were some exceptions to this, but a lot of it was really what we've seen since day one in terms of the fundamental principles that seem to be operating within newsrooms and who editors in particular think is worth hearing from. Like, we had a lot of stories that still deferred to either the Israeli government perspective or to the feelings of Jewish Australians. It was very, very hard to find the voices of actual individual Palestinians in the vast majority of the coverage that was splashed in the newspapers this week. The Guardian, and this is not just an Australian Guardian thing, this is sort of the international section. They had a special section on their website, Israel Gaza 2 years on. And like some of the headlines, Israelis mark 2 years since Hamas attack that killed 1,200. Kibbutz residents ponder return home after Hamas attack. I hear him screaming, brother of Israeli hostage describes agonizing 2 years. Now, obviously, I am not saying that the media shouldn't cover like 2 years of the actual attack on October 7th. But that is like 3 out of 3 stories that are focused entirely on the Israeli perspective. And so many people more articulate than me on this point have talked about, people like Randa Abdel Fattah, this didn't begin on October 7. It's not going to end on October 7. There is so much. If we're going to use this moment as a way to understand what is really going on in Gaza, it just doesn't really seem accurate to just center the perspectives of Israelis or of Jewish Australians in Australia reflecting on that. To me, the issue is the massive amount of disproportionate weight being applied to that sort of side of this. I mean, much as it's not about equal sides. That to me has stood out from the last few days.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think as well, it goes to the point that pretty much everywhere, I think, still at the most senior levels, like these kind of rollouts are planned by the most senior editors. Often it's like the star reporters, the federal politics and foreign affairs correspondents who are writing a lot of this. I think at the most senior levels, those things that we've talked about still exist. I would point just to, in terms of the green shoots, I was heartened to see like some real journalism being done, but really by, I think, specialist reporters, often our friends at Declassified Australia, independent places, broke a story about Australia's F-35 fighter jet components, and the Australian government ripped down the web page about the parts we manufacture.
Oh, wow.
And
I hadn't seen that.
The ABC actually followed up that story and did a really good piece about that web page disappearing from the internet, about our contributions to the F-35 program. But I just mean that stuff, as you say, when it comes to anniversary coverage, it's a great barometer of like where the most senior editors, the senior desks are at. And those green shoots that we talk about, they are happening. There are good stories out there, but they're often, coming from other parts of the organizations, more junior areas. I think those people are the ones who are doing the best work 2 years in.
Yeah. I think that it's a good reminder, and you said this at the start of our conversation on this, like the leadership of these organizations has remained the same and I can't think of any examples where anyone's been forced to sort of say, hey, we got this wrong, right? Or we did the wrong thing in these instances. There's been no serious organizational or leadership shift towards a better position. And in fact, in a number of news organizations, I would argue like more bad people have come into more senior roles in terms of how they cover this issue and how they cover so many others. Scott, most of the reporting this week actually, and this continues into today, it's driven by the political reaction to some graffiti that appeared in Melbourne on Tuesday morning on the anniversary of October 7th. Slogans painted in Fitzroy that said, "Glory to Hamas," and another bit of graffiti vandalism that said, "October 7, do it again." I mean, the political reaction to this from some quarters was pretty predictable. Susan Lee blamed Anthony Albanese for, quote, allowing hate to take root onto our streets and into our communities. Israel's government weighed in as well. Their Deputy Foreign Minister, Sharon Haskell, someone we've discussed before, who's got close links to Australia, said to the Prime Minister, "Get your country in order. Stop the Jew hate." And the coalition really took up that line, politician after politician on their side, blaming Albanese for these kinds of incidents. And what struck me, Scott, is how credulously the entire media establishment is taking this graffiti. If you had no idea what had happened in the past 2 years, you saw that graffiti, you'd think, this is pretty bad. Like, it's pretty bad that there are people in the community who think these kinds of things and are willing to commit acts of vandalism to do it. And like, good on Susan Lee for calling out how bad this is. But all that requires you to have been in a coma for the last 2 years, right? It is now an established fact in the courts of Australia that the vast majority of these kinds of vandalism or kind of arson incidents have been driven either by underworld figures with their own motivations paying petty criminals, or, according to the federal government, this is like the federal government's position now, the Iranian government running some kind of like international racket. We've documented in our newsletter how this is the vast majority of these kinds of incidents that have been linked to kind of actors from those backgrounds. This has nothing to do with the government allowing hate to take root in our communities. Like, it's just crazy to me that the media has finally been reporting on like the real actors behind these incidents, but then another one happens and we all forget that and we pretend that, you know, Melbourne is just full of people who want October 7 to happen again, and that is somehow the fault of Anthony Albanese. And look, I've kind of bitten my tongue on this for a while, but it is getting like particularly ridiculous that you see these graffiti or vandalism incidents happen, and like within minutes, a politician from the Israeli government starts interfering in Australian politics and attacking the government of Australia, stepping in and saying these incidents are happening because of the Albanese government. I mean, none of these slogans are in any way the messaging of the pro-Palestine movement in Australia. And I know people say, oh, there's some radicals out there, there are some fringe groups. I don't even know if that's true. I don't know if there are any fringe groups in Australia that want October 7 to happen again. But if you are part of like some group and some guy in it is like, hey, I think we should do some vandalism in Fitzroy that says glory to Hamas, let's do October 7 again. Let me give you a tip. They're probably an ASIO plant. Like, that is so stupid and dumb and so clearly designed to create an opportunity for the Israeli government, for the coalition, for the right-wing media to demonize the entire Palestine movement. I just don't really believe that there are real activists doing it. But even if you want to leave aside my conspiracy theory, we have enough evidence. And like I said, this is the government's official position that most of this stuff is confected by actors unrelated to the pro-Palestine movement. So why do the media keep reporting like this is reflective of a real current in Australian society?
Oz, this is the moment when all of our listeners are probably sitting there going, oh, like Scott is going to come in and be a coward and like even things out, take the temperature down. You are completely right. It's crazy. And like if I was, you know, ASIO or the CIA or Mossad or something, and it was like, are the pro-Palestine movement going to target a weapons factory, an exporter of arms to Israel, blah, blah, blah. I could not wish for something better served up on a platter than, oh no, let's target an art gallery instead. Let's paint graffiti that says glory to Hamas. I couldn't wish for a gift better than that. And it's all bizarre that it is just being when we know so much now, as you say, about all kinds of actors involved in this stuff, that it's just being taken at face value and Susan Ley gets to pop off.
Yeah, I mean, if you're reading between the lines, Scott and I have, some theories as to like which intelligence agencies may be pushing certain buttons when it comes to civil society in Australia. But again, I just want to reiterate, if you just don't want to engage in that, fine. But we know that like upwards of 90% of these incidents have either been underworld figures overseas paying petty criminals and like homeless people to do acts to get media coverage to help them negotiate like lesser sentences in like whatever drug cartels they're involved in, or according to the government, the intelligence agencies of Iran. So it's not a fucking conspiracy. Like, it's like the media should at least just mention that when these incidents have happened, in 90% of the cases, it's been these people. That is what is driving me crazy. So you don't have to indulge conspiracies to understand how bad the coverage of this is, right? That's fair.
I love that I went so hard that you then had to temper it. You had to be the one to.
You brought up Mossad, so I just thought, we have to give all the sides in terms of the different intelligence agencies that could be operating here. All right, Scott, coming up after the break, the controversy surrounding one of the most prestigious journalistic bodies in Australia, and a look at the surprising companies who fund them.
The National Press Club Oz, most people probably know it from the speeches made there and all the stories about them. You know, if the ABC gets a new chair, it's where they go to give a speech talking about what they are going to do. The government decides to change its promises on, tax cuts. Albanese heads to the press club to give a speech explaining their decision, their thinking. But rarely is the press club itself the story. The club itself, for like people who don't know, is a venue in Canberra. And it's basically run like a professional association for the federal politics journalists in Canberra. You join, you can go to events there, lunches, the big speeches, book launches, and it's run by a board of veteran reporters who cover Parliament. Well, this week it did become the story, Oz, because an independent journalist from the US, Chris Hedges, who's a former New York Times foreign correspondent, has since dabbled around in all kinds of independent media and at one point Russia Today. But he's built quite a following and has, almost 200,000 subscribers around the world. And over the weekend, he hit send on an article saying he'd been booked to speak at Australia's National Press Club during his upcoming tour, and the press club cancelled it because of his critical reporting on Israel's genocide in Gaza. And he accused the club of caving to the Israel lobby. And then, Oz, interestingly, the press club issued a pretty rare statement to deny what Hedges said. And it was a strange read. The statement is what tipped us off that there was something odd about this, didn't it?
Yeah, strange statement, very strange sequence of events. And there was a lot of outrage about Hedges' talk seemingly being cancelled, right? And when he sent this story out to his hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And I feel like that's probably why they felt like they needed to say something. They don't really issue statements that often. This is only the second public statement they've issued all year, and we're going to discuss the first one in a little bit. But a couple of bits stood out to me in this statement. The first bit was that they denied that they'd locked in any talk by Hedges at all. They said that it was only tentatively agreed to, right? So already there was this conflict between what Hedges was saying, what the press club was saying. But there was this line: the club is constantly reviewing its address schedule, and when more details of the address were made available, we decided to pursue other speakers on this matter. So that kind of immediately raises questions like, who made this decision to cancel the speech on the basis of what was in the address? Like, what was the address about? What disturbed them? Really odd behavior from an organization run by journalists that is supposed to host just frank conversations. It's not really the job of the board to censor what people say. They just host these people and they talk and they get questions asked and onwards we go. So we decided to take a closer look at what was going on, and we managed to obtain some correspondence between the National Press Club CEO, Maurice Riley, and the organizers of Chris Hedges' tour in Australia, the Australian Friends of Palestine Association. And this correspondence, Scott, which, as I mentioned, we wrote about exclusively for our subscribers on Tuesday, it cast a lot of doubt on the press club's public statements on this issue. We've seen documents from the press club that confirm Hedges was booked in to speak on October 20. These were confirmed on very official National Press Club letterhead, right? And in response to that, after this confirmation was sent out, the press club then asked the organizers to send headshots, biographic information of Chris Hedges, a blurb for the talk, all the things you ask for when organizing an event like this. To me, it's pretty clear that this was not a tentative booking. This was like an official booking for October 20. And so the organizers provided all that information and not much happened. But then 2 weeks later, seemingly out of nowhere, the CEO wrote back to the Australian Friends of Palestine, and the subject of his email was all caps, urgent, cancellation, Chris Hedges address. Kind of already, even from there, you cancel an event once it's been booked. It's not a tentative thing, right? You just say, hey, we decided that we don't want to do this thing. When you say cancel, it's because you've booked something and now you're trying to undo it. In the email, the CEO, Maurice Riley, wrote that the National Press Club had reviewed its speaker program, and because the organization was receiving an excess of proposals in favor of Palestine, which is understandable in the current environment, like no shit, man, Hedges' talk was going to be cancelled in the interest of balancing out our program, right? So two things pretty obvious there, Scott. One is, yes, this was booked and then cancelled. And then secondly, it was cancelled because the press club was worried about balance and a perception that Hedges was too pro-Palestine. Worth just like sitting on that for a second, because that does contradict like what the press club has said publicly, but also raises some pretty big and fundamental questions around a body run by Australian political journalists cancelling a talk because in their minds they are hosting too many speakers that are pro-Palestine, and that Hedges, who was going to deliver a talk on journalism and journalism's failures when it comes to Gaza, was going to be too pro-Palestine. Now, I'm not aware of the press club cancelling any other talk for a speaker being too pro one issue. I mean, like, let's be honest, 99% of the press club speakers are pro something. That's why they go to the press club to talk about a policy issue, talk about their company, talk about their political party. So it's kind of a spurious kind of line of argument from them. The press club has hosted speakers before that you could argue are like sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, right? Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian territories. And last week they had Professors Ben Saul and Chris Sidoti, two human rights experts. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that those three people are not activists for the Palestinian cause. They are either UN officials or human rights experts. And the fact that they are describing in like legal terms the war crimes being committed by Israel doesn't make them in favor of the Palestinian cause. It makes them independent experts speaking independently about how international law works. So when it comes to the issue of, is the press club leaning too much in favor of Palestine? Well, they have had the Israeli ambassador speak, right? And that is certainly someone who's pro-Israel, not an independent legal expert. They've not had any Palestinian or any Palestinian Australian speaker. So I find it hard to understand their argument that another independent journalist who has reported on the region, he was the New York Times Middle East bureau chief, right? He's reported on war for a lot. The idea that like that person that, and in their email, they sort of put him in the context of Ben Saul and Chris Sidoti and said, we've had all these experts come in and they're too pro-Palestine, so we just can't have you anymore. It's just a really, really, really stark example of the fake and forced balance that political journalists in Australia seem to operate within, that they can't comprehend. People talking factually about what's going on is not pro or anti something. It is just them reporting on what's happening or talking about the way the law works when it comes to Israeli war crimes.
Yeah, and look, to give some credit, I think I certainly, and I don't think many Australians would have seen as much of Francesca Albanese covered when she came to Australia if she didn't come to the National Press Club and she didn't do that address. But as you say, when we're talking about balance, the balance of not having a single Palestinian in the last 2 years is, I think, interesting to highlight. I ended up speaking to the CEO of the press club, Maurice Riley, on Tuesday night, who gave me a call. He's overseas at the moment, so it took a while for us to get onto him. He disputed the characterization of this letter as an official confirmation, Oz. He said, look, this is a standard template letter we send out to people before they send more details, and downplayed the difference as semantics. Obviously, as you said, it's on National Press Club letterhead and says confirmed in bold and underline, though. So
yeah, and you can see that on our Instagram and on our website. Like it's pretty damn official. Yeah,
it looks quite official. You can see that on our Instagram. But look, he basically just stood by the original statement and sort of denied that anything untoward had taken place. Oz, your point on the speakers and who has spoken at the press club during what we've seen happening in Gaza, the genocide, it kind of raises bigger questions. And that's sort of what we then started to look at. We got a tip on this from a listener, and I sort of want to thank them for drawing our attention to a lot of what I'm going to say. The first thing is the press club loves to put out statements in defense of journalists, as it should. In 2020, it issued a statement condemning the Malaysian government for arresting some journalists, including Australians who were there covering a story. Last year, it issued a statement calling on the Russian government to release the US journalist Evan Goroskovich. But in the 2 years of Gaza, with over 270 journalists killed by Israel, not arrested, not held, but killed in the greatest slaughter of journalists in like any conflict that is on record that we have numbers for, the NPC hasn't issued a statement of its own. It did sign on to a statement by several press clubs about the killing of 5 journalists at Al Nasser Hospital a month or two ago. That statement, Oz, does not mention Israel or the government of Israel once. There's no call, there's no condemnation, unlike the other statements. It just says that the press clubs, quote, call on all parties to uphold international law.
What a joke.
That is a pretty weak statement, Oz, for where we are at in 2025. I saw those kind of statements going around in the first months of Gaza. That's pretty weird and pretty weak when you have other organizations like, whether it's the media union, even the ABC itself, going much further. It's pretty weak in 2025, no?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's also weak that it was issued like 4 weeks ago. Like, this is September 2025. Like, Gaza's fucking genocided. As you said, nearly 300 journalists have been slaughtered by the Israeli government. And the National Press Club, the best thing they can do is sign on to this very weak statement by a handful of other international press clubs as well. They drag their heels, and that's the best they could come up with. And, you know, like, who is the National Press Club? I think it's relevant to understand that, because we understand that the decisions around their speakers and the decisions around whether they sign up to statements are made by the board of the press club, and often in conjunction with the CEO, but the board obviously are the governing organization of this body. They're not randoms. They're some of the most senior, high-profile, influential political journalists in the country. The president is Tom Connell, a political reporter at Sky News. Jay Norman is the director of the board. She's a federal political reporter at the ABC. Anna Henderson is on the board. She's the chief political correspondent at SBS. Andrew Probyn is on the board. He is Nine's national affairs editor. Like, these are not just the most senior journalists at some of the biggest media companies in the country. They're some of the most senior journalists in the country. And so the fact that they're the ones making these decisions about who speaks or signing up to these statements, I think is a reflection of just where the Canberra sort of press gallery brain is at on this issue.
And yeah, and I think the question becomes then, like, why would this be? You know, why would the press club maybe potentially be a bit weak on this? And like, as you say, like, this isn't like the Murdoch press where you've got like some owner bearing down on journalists. It's an association run by journalists for journalists. Why not speak out forcefully in defense of journalists? And that's when it's interesting to turn to how the National Press Club makes its money, sponsors. Oz, if you or anyone listening go on the sponsors page for the National Press Club, you will see, first of all, 4 of the biggest weapons manufacturers in the entire world, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Thales, and Raytheon.
Yeah,
we're talking about like
Jeez.
some of the biggest companies in the world with billions of dollars of contracts with Israel. These are the companies that sell Israel their F-35 fighter jets, who sell them the howitzer artillery that's fired tens of thousands of shells into Gaza, the artillery, the Hellfire missiles Israel uses. But that's not all. There's also lobbyists who are sponsors. And these lobbyists act for other big defense companies, like they're lobbyists for Elbit Systems, who supply Israel's drone fleet, the weapons company behind the Iron Dome, the Israeli company Rafael, the tech surveillance company Palantir, which is allegedly involved in Israel's use of AI to select targets. The peak body for Australia's arms industry is also a sponsor, the AIDN. By the time you add all these up, Oz, you've got like about a dozen of the world's biggest weapons companies
Holy
with
shit.
some connection to a sponsor for the National Press Club. And just that fact alone, separated from everything else, it's like, is this the sponsorship list for like a club that put on some lunches and host talks, or is it like the sponsorship list for like Nick Cage's character in Lord of War? It's insane to me.
Underrated film.
It's just like so bizarre. And it brings me to the bigger issue with all of this, which is, you know, in their statement on the cancellation of Hedges, the NPC said, quote, "The board and its CEO, Maurice Riley, make decisions on speakers independently." Well, Oz, if that is true, then guess who the board and the CEO booked to speak next week? Completely independently, completely pure reasons. They booked Mike Johnson, the CEO of AIDN, the peak lobby group the Australian arms industry I mentioned is a sponsor. Now, like when I spoke to Riley, I put all of this to him. I have to say he really downplayed it. And there is, you know, it's worth hearing him out. He said, like, look, the only people who decide who speaks is him and the board, and these sponsors weren't major, that these sponsorships act almost like pre-bookings, a line of credit to use to attend events at the club. And he pointed to lots of peak bodies for like farmers, the medicines industry. He said, like, this is Canberra. They're all a member somewhere. And just strongly denied that a sponsorship guaranteed speaking slots or that they would be feted or celebrated in any way by the club. But it's interesting to me that the NPC doesn't seem to have sponsorship rules about who it accepts money from. And there have to be questions in a moment like this where there's a genocide going on. Like, is it appropriate for a body of journalists to be taking money from like just about every major weapons manufacturer? It's just weird. It just seems odd.
It seems super odd. And it's like the obvious question is, oh, okay, so there's no benefit to being a sponsor, right? Which is like the line of the company, which then begs the question. It's like, why do these companies bother being sponsors? You know, it's like when politicians say donating to the Labor or Liberal Party doesn't get you any access. Well, I mean, like, that's a lie, because literally they have all these business forums where if you donate them heaps of money, you get to have private meetings with ministers. It's also like, you know, giant companies and fossil fuel companies that don't donate to politicians just because they love the idea of democracy and getting like leaflets out to people. I think the same goes for this. Like, there's a reason why the people, and when he says this is Canberra, yes, that is Canberra. That's how it works. And it's pretty fucking gross. Why does the National Press Club, Scott, like need sponsors? Like you said, it's like a room that has lunches and some speeches. And why do they need like 4 of the biggest weapons manufacturers in the world? Like, this is extraordinary. I can't, just that as a thing is weird to me. But then the bit where like, I think it's pretty insidious, and I think this needs to be covered more. Like Media Watch, like, you know, do something on this, please, so it kind of puts more attention on it. The directors of the National Press Club, right? So these are the directors who govern this organization, have a fiduciary duty to run it effectively, and, you know, presumably have some relationships with these sponsors. They are pretty much all involved in covering what Israel is doing in Gaza, right? They're involved in reporting on accusations that Australia is sending arms to Israel, which we know they're doing in the form of F-35 fighter jets. How can they cover these things while simultaneously being directors, and in one instance, the president of an organization funded by weapons companies who are profiting off Israel's war? And as far as I'm aware, until this Chris Hedges thing blew up, no one was talking about this. It's totally wild.
Yeah, I feel like the weird thing about it is like there's been a very big and very public like discussion about entertainment venues, cultural bodies being like sponsored by gas companies and things. It's like the Sydney Opera House or like the Festival of Dangerous Ideas or like the Sydney Writers Festival would never, they would be crucified if they accepted donations, sponsorships from that many weapons companies. But here you have journalists meant to be pursuing the truth over this, and their club holds these sponsorships. Whether or not there's a conflict of interest, it feels like it isn't great for like public perception of, you know, like the perception there could be a conflict. There is already huge distrust in media and journalism. Is it great for the public who maybe are very cynical about the media to just see that and think there may be a conflict? So like they can deny that they're, you know, and very well that it may bear no, you know, it may not influence them whatsoever. There may be no great benefit. There may be small contributions, but like the appearance, I think, is awful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Scott, coming up after the break, an update on the Gaza flotilla and a look at the big media deal that is sending shockwaves throughout the US and the rest of the media industry. Okay, Scott, so we actually flagged this news a few months ago when media reporters in the US started covering these negotiations that were going on between one David Ellison, the new owner of the media company Paramount in the US, and Bari Weiss, the ex-New York Times writer turned anti-woke crusader. And the negotiations were about buying her startup, The Free Press. Now, a quick refresher on who these people are. David and his dad, Larry, they like keep coming up on this podcast. This is basically a keeping up with the Ellisons show now because of the influence that they have on everything that we discuss. Larry owns Oracle, the software giant. He's a friend of Trump's, and he's set to be one of the owners of TikTok as it transfers its ownership to the US. His son David just bought Paramount, the media company that owns, amongst other things, Channel 10 here in Australia, and CBS News in the US, one of the biggest networks there, and the home of 60 Minutes, which is still the most watched current affairs investigative program in the country. Bari Weiss is a right-wing journalist who first made a name for herself as a student at Columbia University in New York. She was attacking professors that she and other Zionist students accused of being too pro-Palestine. This is back in the 2000s, Scott, in case anyone thinks that this stuff hasn't been going on for a very, very long time. She worked on the opinion desk at the Wall Street Journal and was a writer for a couple of years at the New York Times, where she took kind of, I guess, increasingly right-wing, and she might describe them as like edgy stances on social and political issues, positioning herself at the forefront of anti-wokeness. That's kind of who she is and how she became a household name in media.
Yeah, and I was like, I got to say, who can forget her stint in Australia? In 2018, the New York Times sent her out here back in the days when places like the Times were looking to expand out in Australia and push into the market here. And the Times promised she'd cover, quote, Australia's role in the world, politics and feminism, and also working on partnerships and events. But this was Oz shortly after she'd written a pretty famous piece about the kind of Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, Lex Friedman podcast world, and she coined the term the intellectual dark web. And the Australia assignment was largely seen by media writers in the US as a way of shuffling Bari Weiss off to the side. My favorite summary was from a publication called The Outline, who wrote, Bari Weiss is to be shipped off to Australia like a 19th century bread thief. And she didn't actually write much while she was out here, Oz. My favorite, though, was this essay on how brilliant Australia is. It's titled, Australians Have More Fun, What We Can Learn from Canada in a Thong. People can look that up, but it includes this nugget of gold. Australia should be a startup nation. Ask Australians why it isn't like Tel Aviv or Silicon Valley, and they will invariably chalk it up to tall poppy syndrome. Oh, Oz, how Australians wish that this was like Tel Aviv or Silicon Valley. Oh my God.
Yeah, I love asking random Australians why Australia isn't more like Tel Aviv, and they say it's because of tall poppy syndrome. Crazy. Yeah. I think a lot of smart people realize that she was kind of full of shit and just trying to carve a name for herself by taking this provocative kind of stance on stuff. She ended up quitting the Times in 2020. She accused the paper's editors of being too driven by the woke Twitter mob, which is funny as a reflection of what Twitter was like in 2020. There is no woke Twitter mob left. And I think also an insight into how much she tried to turn herself into a free speech martyr. Like, there are people who were convinced that she was fired by the Times because Twitter put pressure on that. Just did not happen. No one was trying to fire her. After she left, she wrote a piece where she compared herself to Galileo Galilei, the scientist who was threatened by being burnt at the stake if he did not renounce his scientific views.
Oh my God.
That is Bari's sort of sense of herself. After leaving the Times, she launched an outlet called The Free Press, which is a startup very much based on her political views. It's unashamedly pretty right-wing. It's pretty pro-Trump these days, and it is very, very, very pro-Israel. So that company is the one that has just been bought by David Ellison and Paramount for a cool $150 million US. And Weiss, as well as being bought out, is going to be the editor-in-chief of CBS News. Now, the obvious question is, why? Like, why is David Ellison, who has bought this kind of middle-of-the-road, respectable news network, spending so much money on Bari Weiss and putting her in charge of setting the editorial agenda? I think there's a few answers to that. The first is Ellison, because of his own political views, wants to pivot CBS to the right. And as well as his own political views, it fits into this broader shift that we are seeing in America that we've covered on this show, where big media owners are trying to placate Trump. They're trying to get rid of the journalists and the programs and the kinds of stories that annoy him and send the message, we are supporting you and your agenda, so give us a free pass to do whatever we want, to buy companies, to merge companies, and just make billions and billions of dollars. And we've already seen big shifts at CBS. Even before the Bari Weiss announcement, there's been resignations from people in big roles because they were frustrated that their stories were being spiked or watered down. They thought that was happening because the owners wanted to appease Donald Trump. I think the other part of this is a reward for Bari Weiss from a billionaire class who are sympathetic and aligned with her. She created something that's boosted Donald Trump, it's boosted Israel, and this is the reward that she gets. And I'll talk a bit later about why this deal makes no business sense, but this is, to my mind, an ideological reward for Weiss for being such a dutiful soldier in the media landscape. And I think the final part of this is that, like, there's been some of the coverage in America is like, oh, when Bari Weiss joins, there's going to be an exodus of talented staff from CBS News. This is a really dumb decision. I agree. I think it's a terrible decision that will, really significantly negatively impact CBS News. But I think driving out the centrist or progressive or like just normal down the line journalists is the point. I think what they're trying to do by this is saying, if you don't subscribe to this worldview, there is no place for you, so leave. And this is something news organizations do. They do it deliberately because they want to change the culture of these places because they disagree with the culture of these places. And Scott, kind of all of that taken together, it seems pretty bad for media diversity and just the general balance of the news in America.
Oh, totally. And like, for Australians, it's like CBS News is the station of like Walter Cronkite hosted CBS News, Dan Rather, Edward R. Murrow from Good Night and Good Luck, one of our journalistic heroes, helped build the news division at CBS. That's the history. Those are the types of people that work there. And then to buy this right-wing media startup launched by a columnist and install her as the boss of all of that history and infrastructure, that is clearly inserting her to change the editorial tone. She's going to be the boss of seasoned journalists and EPs, and you've got to imagine it's going to be pretty explosive how that goes down, Bari telling them what to put on the air. I just thought I'd mention I was on Bari's relationship with Australia, just like a little kicker on the end of that is like, sadly for us and probably anyone at Channel 10, Bari's opinion has changed a bit since that piece I mentioned, the Canada in a thong era, where she tweeted at the beginning of the year a story from her startup, this thing, The Free Press, written by Australian Israel lobbyist Alex Rivchin. And she posted the story with the quote, "Jew hatred in Australia is out of control." So that's where she's currently at with her read of Australia.
Well, yeah. So Channel 10 is owned by this company. Like, it remains to be seen how this stuff will filter down. Remember, they'll flog off the network, but it's not a good sign. And the other thing about the structure of this is Weiss, who's the editor-in-chief, is reporting directly to David Ellison, the owner of the company. So even if you want to leave aside the politics for a second, I don't think you should, but even if you want to, that just means like there's no firewall between the ownership of this big company and the editorial direction. And there's a reason why news organizations have these layers. It's often to go back to this idea of, perceptions of conflicts or bias. It at least gives the journalists and the public, your audience, this sense of, well, sure, there's an owner. Every news organization's got an owner, but the journalists are removed from that by multiple layers of like management. In this instance, the owner is the direct boss of the editor-in-chief. That is like a fundamentally flawed mechanism when it comes to independent journalism. And it's been interesting looking at the coverage of this announcement. I mean, the US smaller media outlets, places like Semaphore and places like that, have been like pretty incredulous at what's going on. But the bigger media companies, it's kind of lackluster. Like the Guardian US's piece on this described her as a heterodox thinker and said her politics were hard to categorize. They said in past interviews, she's described herself as a radical centrist, politically independent, and a classical liberal. It's like, why are we letting these like right-wing lunatics describe themselves as radical centrists? Why not just write, she says this, but here are her positions on Israel, on Trump, on feminism, and all these things. It's pretty odd that she's getting such like a soft touch when she's being put in this position because she is right-wing. And I think the other thing about this that makes it pretty clear that this is about ideology and not about like good business is I think Weiss is going to be very bad at this job. She's never been a reporter. When she's working at the Wall Street Journal and at the New York Times, she was an opinion writer or an opinion editor. So she doesn't actually understand the mechanics of journalism. She's never worked in TV, and CBS News is a giant TV network. She had her first call with CBS News staff on Tuesday, and Max Tani, who's a media reporter at Semaphore, said she ended her remarks with, "Let's do the fucking news." Feels like someone who's like watched the newsroom more than they have actually like been in a newsroom.
I don't know. I might say that if somebody made me the boss of a TV network.
And I think like as another example of how media owners in this era, because they're billionaires who make most of their money from other stuff, right? Whether that's Jeff Bezos or whether that's the Ellisons, they don't really care about making profitable, sustainable news businesses. They just want to shift the political conversation. That kind of brings me to the kind of economics of this deal. The Free Press's annual revenue is $15 million a year. Like, that's a modest amount of money, but it's also not bad for a small startup that just started a few years ago. But it getting bought out for $150 million, like 10 times its valuation, those are the kinds of figures that like a tech startup that has revolutionized, something fucking AI related or whatever in this crazy moment that we live in. That's the valuation that they get. So this is not a sensible use of money. This is absolutely a billionaire looking after an ideological bedfellow. And Scott, to bring this back home to Australia, there was some commentary on this deal that raised my eyebrows. It was from Zara Seidler, one of the founders of Australia's like favorite Gen Z for Zionist publication, the Daily Oz, right? So she said in a LinkedIn post on this, there's a lot to say about Bari Weiss's marriage of the new and old worlds of media. And I was like, oh, interesting. There is a lot to say. I wonder what she's going to say. Then she said, the most obvious being that innovation and iteration are key to the survival of legacy outfits. What the fuck? Like, there is a lot to say about Bari Weiss, but I'm not sure it's that innovation and iteration are like the ways here for the future of media, and that she and the Free Press somehow represent that more than they represent a startup that is just explicitly about shifting the conversation to be more pro-Israel and more pro-Trump.
Well, it's also really funny to say there's a lot to say and then say some nothing gobbledygook that you could say like about literally anything. The most obvious being that innovation and iteration are key to the, it's like, what the heck? There's a lot to say. Virtually nothing banal nonsense I could read in any LinkedIn post. What?
Yeah, real LinkedIn posting. But she did go on. Went on to describe Weiss's like list of journalistic principles that she's laid out ahead of her tenure at CBS. Seidler described them as a blueprint for the future, right? And like, look, it's amazing how much of the coverage, as I already mentioned, is trying to depoliticize Weiss and try to present her as this media business genius when we've established that's not what's going on. But it's pretty fascinating to see someone who runs a media company in Australia that tries very hard to project itself as a progressive, youth-focused outlet, showering Weiss with praise and hailing this deal. Like, what we ran through and the way that we described it, maybe like we use slightly stronger language, that is not a like fringe opinion. This is largely the opinion of smart media writers in the US. So really, really odd stuff from the co-founder of the Daily Oz there.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to look to Bari Weiss for, lessons on the future of media, it's sort of not doing any real reporting, sort of just regurgitating things in sort of conversational style that, I mean, that's what the Free Press is. I mean, like if that's the great lesson of Bari Weiss and that's the future of media, it's grim times. You take the ideological stuff out of it. It's just like not very good journalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
As I wanted to mention, in keeping tabs this week, Greta Thunberg, people would have seen she was detained by Israel after the latest flotilla to Gaza carrying aid was intercepted and the Israelis arrested everybody. Now, there have been allegations that Israeli authorities singled out Thunberg in particular. I mean, mistreated a lot of the people they arrested, but some really horrific treatment alleged against her, that she was dragged by her hair, beaten, forced to pose with the Israeli flag and kiss it by prison guards. Really disturbing reports. What I found fascinating about this, and I want to add, is that after the Israeli government initially denied those reports, the far-right minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's actually the minister responsible for prisons, so he is central to the story, basically came out and confirmed they had mistreated her. He said, I went to visit Ketziot prison and I was proud that we were treating the flotilla activists as terror supporters. Whoever supports terrorism is a terrorist and deserves the conditions of terrorists.
Jeez.
He's just saying...
Yeah, he's saying it. He's just saying it.
Yeah, we did it, and I'm super proud of it. What's interesting, Oz, is in all the dozens of Australian media reports about Thunberg's arrest, she's obviously a huge figure the media love, I could not find one article that included that quote from Ben-Gvir. It was all like, activists claim this, Israel denies it. when you have the prisons minister saying they did it. And we've talked about how like Australian media love quoting Israeli sources, except suspiciously when they just say out loud the horrific stuff they're doing. Then suddenly we don't want to quote Israeli sources. So, that was sort of maddening, although I do have to give a little bit of credit to the ABC for a story that got their hands on testimonies that Australians on this flotilla gave to embassy officials when they were released, saying that Ben Gvir had been in the prison taunting them while they were in their cells. So that story was pretty revealing and put Ben Gvir on the scene. Yeah, beside that, though, it was pretty grim, I have to say.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about how unwilling the Australian media has been for the last few years to just quote what like Ben Gvir and people like Smotrich and the kind of hard right who are propping up Netanyahu's government say. You could just run their comments every day because they are saying the most deranged stuff. The reason why they don't do it is because it completely undermines the argument that they're making that all Netanyahu is trying to do is get back the hostages and this is not a genocide. Like, when you read what those ministers say, it is very explicit they want to wipe out every Arab and colonize and annex Gaza. So it's very hard for the Australian media to quote them accurately and hold their line that this is a just war that Israel is conducting.
Totally. I mean, the other thing I just wanted to mention, this is, not as significant as, the coverage of the genocide, but I just thought it was interesting that, like, to examine as an example of Greta Thunberg as a media figure, like she drives a lot of conservatives in the media totally crazy. Like they have a complete brain snap at this small Scandinavian young woman saying anything. And like, here's some of the things that have been said about her recently. A contributor for Newsmax Australia, this guy, Daniel Lukowitz, he posted on Twitter, quote, "I want Greta Thunberg terrified. I want her screaming and begging for it to stop. I want her rocking in a corner, covering her eyes, pissing and shitting in her pants." That was like a week ago before this happened.
Wow.
Like, that is the most egregious example. But obviously you have like less violent, but still like pretty hateful stuff coming from the more regular conservatives, I would say. Danica DiGiorgio on Sky News last week said, the pathetic little gremlin was heading back out on a freedom flotilla, and then sarcastically added, because it went so well for them last time. And gosh. Andrew Bolt famously got kind of wrapped over the knuckles for calling her deeply disturbed and said people shouldn't listen to a girl with so many mental disorders. I just want to sort of take this keeping tabs moment to say to all of those people, what's wrong, team? Like, Greta got the comeuppance you all wanted. Itamar Ben-Gvir is saying he did it. Like, what you all fantasized about is happening. Don't you want to celebrate, guys? Don't you want to talk about these quotes? Don't you want to go, yes, we did it. We got her.
Yeah. He is terrifying her. He is doing all these things we demanded.
Yeah, great. The pathetic little gremlin has like gotten her comeuppance, but like, no, all the fantasizing about mistreating a young woman was just like a rhetorical advice to like spread kind of like hatred of her. You only want to talk about it hypothetically, not like when it actually happens, guys. Like,
real tough guys.
Pathetic.
Yeah, some of those quotes are disgusting and kind of
disgusting,
terrifying. Yeah. As well as I think like your quite fair, critique of these like lunatic far right figures who go after Greta. I also want to just save some space for the left-wing people who used to love Greta Thunberg and now have like nothing to say. Like in 2019, when Greta Thunberg was Times Person of the Year for all of her climate stuff, Hillary Clinton was like, could not think of a better person to be Times Person of the Year. There was a huge amount of like liberal Americans and, Western liberals who were like, this girl rules, like good on her for what she's doing. Now she's being like kidnapped and tortured by the Israeli government and they have nothing to say about it. It's
good point.
It's remarkable. It's remarkable.
Good point. Well, on that dispiriting note about everyone being pathetic and awful and weak. Yeah, great.
That's it. That's it from us for the week. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. Remember, you can subscribe to support our work at lamestream.com.au. You can also email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer, Bez, and thank you to our video producer, Schwen. Scott, I'll see you back here on Monday.
Absolutely, you will. See you next week, Oz.